The honourable member for Whitby.
Today, Mr. Speaker, I want to address the real freedom fighters of this pandemic. I want to acknowledge the vast majority of Canadians who graciously fulfilled their civic duty time and time again. I'm referring to those who've chosen to exercise their freedom in pursuit of the common good and continually protect the health and safety of others. We are forever grateful to you for doing your part, for trusting in science, and joining the almost 90% who've gotten vaccinated. Know that your countless number of selfless deeds over the past 2 years speak thousands of times louder than all the horns and voices of angry demonstrators. The immense contributions you've made to our pandemic response make up the convoy that will defeat COVID-19.
South Shore St. Margaret's.
It is with profound mix of both anger and sadness that I rise today to condemn the events that took place on Monday in my 2 riding offices and those of our colleague from West Nova. We received envelopes containing chemical irritants. One staff of mine unwittingly opened the envelope and had to be rushed to hospital, treated and decontaminated. Thankfully, he is fine and back at work. Hateful acts of violence to servants of the people are not an attack on us individually, but an attack on democracy itself.
Mr. Speaker, the pandemic has underscored the current state of healthcare in Canada. Our healthcare institutions are overwhelmed. Massive gaps have been detected. Shortfalls in the entire system is on the brink of collapse. Intensive care units are consistently filled with patients. Surgeries and procedures have been delayed, and staff are completely exhausted. On February 4th, Canada's premiers came together and called on the Prime Minister for help, requesting an unconditional $28 billion boost to healthcare transfers. Earlier this week in Finance Committee, we uncovered $70 billion in new spending, yet none of it for federal healthcare transfers.
The honourable member for Chilliwack Hope.
We now know that before the last election, the Prime Minister made a very purposeful political decision to divide Canadians based on their vaccine status, deliberately tearing at the fabric that unites Canadians in order to hold on to his own privileges and power. The Prime Minister continues to purposely stoke anger and division, hoping that Canadians will turn on each other, rather than his incompetent government that continues to fail at every aspect of COVID response.
The honourable member for Lethbridge.
The Canadian people have suffered an overwhelming amount of trauma in the last 2 years. This is due to forced isolation, countless pandemic restrictions, and moving goalposts. Countries like the UK, Denmark, and Switzerland are returning to normal life, and yet the Prime Minister of Canada won't give a signal of doing the same. It's leaving people confused, frustrated, and hopeless. Domestic violence has increased dramatically, mental health concerns are through the roof, the use of opioids has skyrocketed, life-saving medical treatments have been withheld, cancers have gone undiagnosed, and people have lost their jobs because of a personal medical choice.
Oral questions. Question orale. The honourable leader of the opposition.
Even countries with lower vaccination rates than Canada. Provinces are beginning to lift restrictions and getting life back to normal. Why? Because they're following the science. Canadians are ready to get their life back. But it seems like the Prime Minister wants to live in a permanent pandemic. Dr. Ham, Dr. Tam, Dr. Henry, Dr. Moore, Dr. Hinshaw, Dr. Shahab all agree it's time to shift out of the restrictions and back to normal life. So why is the Prime Minister so offside, not only with the science, but it would seem like with a growing number of his own MPs?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
On the contrary, Mr. Speaker, we intend to follow the science and are working closely with Dr. Tam and other public health officials to ensure that we get through this pandemic as best we possibly can. And that has been through vaccinations. The fact that 9 out of 10 Canadians have gotten vaccinated is one of the reasons why we're able to get through this, is why we've been able to prevent our health systems from being completely overrun. Vaccinations are the thing through this. That's why we're continuing to encourage Canadians to get vaccinated. Why, unfortunately, the Conservatives are against vaccination is, quite frankly, belonging.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Well, the science and the evidence is just simply not on the Prime Minister's side. Many of the reasons previously used to keep Canadians under restrictions are vanishing before our eyes. Other countries are opening up. Provinces are opening up. As he just said, 90% of Canadians have the vaccine. The Prime Minister needs to put his ego aside. He needs to do what's right for the country. He needs to end the mandates. He needs to end the restrictions. He needs to listen to his own caucus. Will he do that?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Canada and Canadians have made it through this pandemic better than many other places because Canadians stepped up. They were there for each other. Their government had their backs. We worked closely with provincial and territorial leaders. Every step of the way, we kept focusing on vaccinations, on public health supports, on business supports. It's allowed us through, and Canadians are continuing to get vaccinated. 60,000 Canadians got vaccinated with their first dose just last week. We are continuing to make sure Canadians get vaccinated because this is how we get through this pandemic.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, we know this Prime Minister has politicized the pandemic. This summer, as BC was burning, Afghanistan was falling, and we were in the fourth wave of a pandemic, the Prime Minister called an unnecessary $600 million election to capitalize on this crisis. According to a senior Liberal MP, a decision was made to wedge, to divide, and to stigmatize. So, a country more divided than ever before. Can the Prime Minister tell Canadians why he would politicize the pandemic, why he would try to stigmatize Canadians, why would he do this to a country that is already suffering and deeply damaged by so many of his policies? Why?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
About last year's election. It was an opportunity for Canadians to weigh in on the path forward for our country, on how to continue to fight this pandemic. And what we saw, unfortunately, from the Conservative Party of Canada was a refusal to step up on vaccination, a refusal to follow science. As they were talking about how we get through this pandemic, they couldn't ensure their own MPs got vaccinated. Mr. Speaker, Canadians spoke loudly and clearly in the last election that science and vaccination was the way through. They gave us in this House a mandate to move forward on that, and we did.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
The Prime Minister is clearly trying to strategically and very selfishly divide and stigmatize Canadians. Mr. Speaker, we live in a beautiful country, but our country is suffering. Our country is divided. Our country is tired, and they need leadership. So again, I'm going to ask the Prime Minister. His senior Liberal MP said that there is a strategic decision made on that side to stigmatize, and these are not my words, stigmatize, divide, and wedge. This is what the Prime Minister did. Why?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, what Canadians have needed through this pandemic and what this government has provided has been responsible leadership that put the health and safety of Canadians first and foremost. That's exactly what we did. That's exactly what we talked about in the last election campaign. That's exactly what we're going to continue to do in following the science. But you talk about, the member opposite talks about Canadians suffering. Supply chains disrupted, Canadians in their homes worried of walking their streets because they continue to support blockades that are hurting businesses across the country. Will the Conservative leader stand up and condemn those blockades?
The Honourable Member for Belleuil-Chambly. Thank you. We have to come back to leadership issues during the crisis. The criticism coming from the media is severe, and the internal issues of the Liberal Party are compromising the government's ability to act. Do they recognize that they need to communicate better, maybe with a little bit less pride, and perhaps to change the tone without changing the fundamental objective? Do they recognize that raising the siege is urgent and it needs to be done before this weekend? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I recognize, and we have recognized this for over a week, that this siege is unacceptable. The impact on small businesses, on manufacturers, on the supply chain are ongoing, whether it be barricades at the borders or siege in Ottawa. We have to do everything we can together at every level of government to end it. What would really help is for the Conservative Party to tell its supporters to stop blocking our economy and go home. The Honourable Member for Burnaby South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have truckers that are stuck at the border in the Coutts border crossing in Alberta. We have truckers stuck at the Ambassador Bridge crossing in Windsor. We have an occupation in Ottawa that has hit the citizens and residents and small businesses extremely difficultly. And we know that a significant portion of funding of this convoy is from foreign US dollars. So will the Prime Minister do everything possible to stop this convoy and these protests by contacting US officials and investigating where these funds are coming from and working with them to stop it?
Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we're working very hard with partners at different levels of government to make sure that we're ensuring that the flow of funds to criminal activities is interdicted. We're going to continue to do that while all the same time ensuring that there is a right for free and open legal protests. That is extremely important in this country. I will highlight, however, the irony that the member opposite brought up, which is indeed a harsh one, that when this convoy originally was all about truckers protesting, now it's truckers being protested, being prevented from doing their jobs of putting food on our tables and supporting our manufacturers.
Mr. Speaker, last year an all-party parliamentary committee urged the Prime Minister to promise he wouldn't call an election. In fact, at that time, the Prime Minister himself said he had no interest in calling an election during the pandemic. Canadians were misled. Instead of prioritizing the health and safety of Canadians, he forced an election. This begs the question, why did the Prime Minister jeopardize the health of Canadians to save his own job?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, in that election, Canada had an extremely important conversation about how to move forward through this pandemic. And partially because of the clear answers...
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt the Right Honourable Prime Minister. The Honourable Member for Cumberland Colchester asked a question, and I'm sure he can't hear the answer with all the shouting going on around him. So I'm just going to ask everyone to tone down so that the Honourable Member for Cumberland Colchester can hear the answer. The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, in the last election, Canadians were presented with a very clear choice of moving forward with strong vaccination policies that would ensure Canadians were safe, or the Conservative proposal to not really step up on vaccination, not even ensure that all of their members were vaccinated as MPs, and not the kind of leadership on science they wanted. Canadians made a very clear choice to choose and vote for parties that supported vaccine mandates, and that's exactly what has gotten us through this pandemic to this point, with lower death rates than other countries around the world, despite all the tragedies we have faced.
Honourable Member for Cumberland Colchester.
Mr. Speaker, sadly what we ended up with is seeds of division having been sowed and Canadians suffering. We've suffered financially, socially, morally, mentally, and physically. And according to the Misery Index, we are a very miserable nation. Shame. For almost 2 years now, Canadians have borne the yoke of loss, uncertainty, and lack of hope. The backs of Canadians are about to break. Canadians are miserable because of the Prime Minister. We want to know on what date the mandates will end.
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, once again, we see the Conservatives are willing to twist the facts to their own partisan ends. The reality is vaccine mandates and the fact that Canadians stepped up to get vaccinated to almost 90% ensured that this pandemic didn't hit as hard here in Canada as elsewhere around the world. We stayed focused on following the science, on promoting public health rules, and Canadians stepped up in their communities. They stepped up for their frontline health workers. They stepped up for each other, and Canada has never been so strong and together as we are now.
L'honorable député de Charbot-Saint-Charles.
Mr. Speaker, last November, the Prime Minister said the top priority remains to ensure the safety of Canadians and follow the science. Today, we understand that he didn't base his statement on science. At least two of his members have indicated that the Prime Minister's response has been politicized to divide Canadians. More than a dozen developed countries have begun to remove health restrictions, but this Prime Minister wants to control the public. Can the Prime Minister tell this House when he will remove federal COVID-19 restrictions? The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
From
the beginning of the pandemic, all Canadians have wanted to know when it was going to end and when we could go back to what we were doing before. And at every step, we've had to adjust measures. We've had to put forward proposals and programs to help Canadians based on what was happening at the time. With lowering rates of Omicron infection, we will be able to change things happening throughout the country, but we will always be guided by science, by data, and protecting Canadians at every step, as we have done from the very beginning.
Mr. Speaker, two Liberal MPs have said that the Prime Minister purposely politicized the pandemic. That means for crass political gain, in order to save his own job, the Prime Minister deliberately divided Canadians. We have federal mandates still in effect, stifling industries like travel and tourism, while countries around the world with the same information are finding ways to live with this virus. Speaker, on what date this month will all federal mandates be lifted?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, policy in this country is set by a government that listens to science, that follows data, that doesn't listen to people blockading our streets and blockading our borders. That is not the way to make public policy in this country. It's not the way to bring Canadians together. We're going to stay focused on keeping people alive and safe and healthy and indeed prosperous. But the fact that the Conservative Party continues to refuse to condemn the blockades that are hurting our supply chains, driving up prices, limiting our manufacturers from being able to bring in their parts across the country is a shame on them.
The Honourable Member for Haliburton Kawartha Lakes Rock.
Speaker, Saskatchewan and Alberta have announced an end to restrictions. Canada's chief public health advisories calling for normalcy. Two Liberal MPs have called out their own for divisiveness. Canadians have done everything asked of them for the last 2 years. And while many other countries are offering a plan of hope, the Liberals continue to stifle industries like travel and tourism for little benefit. It seems the Prime Minister has got a little too comfortable with using the force of government rather than trusting Canadians. So, Speaker, on what day this month will all travel advisories be lifted?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, the member opposite talks about stifling industries. The reality is the support of the Conservative Party of Canada for people barricading our streets and our border crossings is harming businesses, is harming Canadians who are putting food on the table, is driving up prices, is causing uncertainty, instability, and frustration on top of people who have suffered too much because of this pandemic over the past 2 years. It is time for the Conservative Party to show responsible leadership, to condemn these blockades, and all of us to move forward together.
Mr. Speaker, there are people across this country asking this Prime Minister for clarity, leadership, and hope. People are so frustrated with this Prime Minister that there's protests nationwide. Canadians are just asking for respect and to be listened to. With the continued uncertainty and brazen disregard for legitimate concerns around the state of our country, I ask the Prime Minister this simple question. Can he share with us what evidence he has to justify implementing an interprovincial trucking mandate?
Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, you can't end a pandemic with blockades. You can't end a pandemic by decreeing it. You can't even end it by legislation. You need to end it with science. You need to end it with public health measures. You need to end
I just want to point out that when the honourable member for Regina Lewin asked his question, it was dead silence. I believe he deserves the same respect when he's getting his answer. The Right Honourable Prime Minister, please proceed.
Mr. Speaker, you cannot stop a pandemic with blockades. You cannot end a pandemic by decree. You can't end a pandemic by legislation. You need to end a pandemic by relying on science, by public health measures, and by vaccinations. That's exactly what we have focused on through these past 2 years. And even as Canadians are tired and impatient for it to end, we are going to continue to be there for them, to support them through it, and to make sure we do everything necessary to end this pandemic.
The honourable member for Regina Lewin.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister just demonstrated why Canadians are so frustrated. He doesn't listen. I asked him to show me some evidence in science around interprovincial trucking mandates, and he totally ignored that question. So my question to him would be maybe a redo, because he maybe will get it right the second time. How high do grocery prices have to go? How empty do grocery stores have to be for him not to implement an interprovincial trucking vaccine mandate?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, the member opposite is criticized something that we haven't even done, so there's already that issue there. But secondly, he talks about empty grocery store shelves. He talks about disruptions to supply chains. The reality is, Mr. Speaker, right now, people in Windsor are suffering and losing their jobs because they can't get auto parts across the Ambassador Bridge. People in Alberta are seeing shelves empty because they can't get deliveries across the Coutts border crossing. And this Conservative Party that supports these blockades won't even stand up and say, enough is enough, it's time to go home.
The honourable member for Grand Prairie Mackenzie.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ireland, Sweden, Norway, Israel, Czech Republic, the UK, Spain, and Denmark are all removing restrictions, including vaccine mandates, even though they have a lower vaccine rate than we do here in Canada. Saskatchewan and Alberta provincial governments have also announced plans to remove their restrictions. When will the Prime Minister follow our international allies, follow the science, follow the expert advice, follow the premiers, and give Canadians a plan as to when he will remove the federal travel restrictions here in Canada?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, throughout the pandemic, different jurisdictions have handled things differently every step of the way, whether it's jurisdictions across the country that we've been there to support, or different countries that have had much worse outcomes in some cases, many more restrictions in other cases. The reality is we will continue to do what is right for Canadians to keep people safe as we get through this pandemic. And yes, I understand how frustrated Canadians are, how much we need to see an end to this pandemic, but we can't do it by decree. We can only do it by continuing to trust science and getting people vaccinated.
The honourable member for Grand Prairie Mackenzie.
Well, Mr. Speaker, that's the problem. There he goes again, refusing to answer the question. It seems he'd rather wedge, divide, and stigmatize fellow Canadians. The problem is that Canadians are better than that. They're sick and tired of his divisive games. They have done their part, and they deserve to know when Canada will follow our international allies and end our restrictions. On what date will the restrictions end?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, Canadians have done their part. They've continued to step up and get vaccinated to a higher percentage, mind you, than the Conservative caucus has. They've continued to follow public health advice. They've continued to be there for each other, to lean on each other. And now we see the Conservative Party continuing to egg on its supporters to shut down border crossings, to encourage its supporters to blockade downtown Ottawa because they're upset they lost an election. Mr. Speaker, we're going to continue to focus on supporting Canadians, on keeping people safe, and on vaccination.
The honourable member for Burnaby South.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians have done their part. They've gotten vaccinated. They've followed public health measures. And now they want a plan that'll get us past this pandemic. That plan is going to, of course, mean we've got to work with our public health officials. And it also means we have to make sure that our healthcare system is never pushed to the brink of collapse again. So will the Prime Minister put forward a plan that will chart the course for us to get past this pandemic that includes properly funding our healthcare system so it's there for our loved ones when they need it most?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we know that our healthcare systems have been stressed during these past 2 years, and that's why, as a federal government, we have continually stepped up. Every year, the federal government sends about $43 billion to the provinces for supporting their healthcare systems. Over the past 2 years, on top of those regular transfers, we have invested about $63 billion in healthcare, whether everything from vaccines to transfers to provinces to other measures to keep Canadians safe. And yes, we will be there to increase healthcare transfers to ensure that we have a stronger medical system into the future.
The Finance Minister continues to try to convince Canadians that all is well with the economy. But what she doesn't seem to understand is that the majority of Canadians just don't see it that way. What they do see is that their family can't afford the same groceries that they used to, and that they will try and squeak in just one more trip back and forth to pick up the kids from school before having to buy another tank of gas. Canadians are facing a cost of living crisis. When will the Finance Minister take this inflation crisis seriously and provide solutions?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
You know what's driving up the cost of living this week? The cost of groceries, the cost of parts for manufacturers? The blockades that the Conservative Party continues to support at the Coutts border crossing, at the Ambassador Bridge in Windsor, and even in downtown Ottawa. Canadians have struggled for 2 years because of this pandemic in so many different ways and have stepped up and made sacrifices, and we've been there to have their backs. Why, right now, does the Conservative Party not have Canadians' backs and instead choose to support those who are blockading their neighbours and our economy?
The Honourable Member for New Brunswick Southwest.
Mr. Speaker, it's been 6 years and these Liberals have failed to make life better for Canadians. They've delivered the largest cost and price increases we've seen in Canada in 30 years. Plus, Ottawa's anti-Canadian energy policies have only added to the pain in the Canadian economy. The rising price of energy sets the prices for virtually everything else in the Canadian economy. Why is the Prime Minister making victims of seniors, working families, and small businesses?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, small businesses in downtown Ottawa are struggling for the past 2 weeks because Conservatives are supporting the people who are blockading them. Businesses in Windsor are suffering because goods can't get across the Ambassador Bridge because Conservative Party supporters are being encouraged to continue their blockades. In Alberta, groceries are getting more expensive because the Coutts border crossing is blocked and the Conservative Party will not condemn or ask those protesters to go home.
In Quebec, gas is now costing over $1.60 per liter. That's unprecedented. This inflation will have repercussions on everything that is transported in Canada. Meanwhile, the Prime Minister seems to not know what is going on. What will the Prime Minister do to help low-income families? Given this increase in the prices of everything that people eat and use in their everyday lives. The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, the global inflation crisis is due to COVID-19. Disruptions in our supply chains are due to COVID-19. And also, partially due to the barricade supported by the Conservatives. We will continue to fight COVID-19 with vaccination, with public health measures, to ensure that soon Canadians can get back to what they enjoy the most. Being together, being with their loved ones, that is what we are working hard to reach.
Kootenay, Columbia.
Mr. Speaker, gasoline is up 34%, housing is up almost 27%, sugar is up 20%, and Canadian bacon is up 17%. Inflation has increased 2 times faster than the wages of those working in my riding of Kootenay, Columbia. Families in Canada are being stretched too far. When will the Prime Minister get off his MacBook at his cottage and fix skyrocketing home prices, supply chain shortages, and the cost of living crisis?
Yeah. The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we recognize that we are in a global inflation crisis right now because of COVID-19, and the best way to get through that is to end this COVID-19 pandemic. Unfortunately, you can't end it with legislation. You can't end it with barricades. You need to end it with science, and that means vaccination. So if the Conservative Party is truly concerned about our supply chains, about the cost of living for Canadians, they should tell their supporters in Coutts and in Windsor to stand down those barricades and let the goods flow to Canadians.
2 weeks ago, the Ethics Committee unanimously, including all Liberal committee members, agreed that a tender be postponed to stop the Liberals from secretly collecting the mobility data of Canadians until MPs could be sure that the privacy rights of Canadians were not being violated. But yesterday, in an unbelievable move, the entire Liberal caucus, including the same members who voted for it, voted against stopping the RFP. What a disgrace. Why would the Prime Minister vote against the committee's recommendations to make sure that the privacy of Canadians were protected?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, unlike the Conservative Party, we believe data, science, and evidence need to inform our response to COVID-19. It is crucial to inform policy and decision-making. The Public Health Agency of Canada has used de-identified data without personal identifiers to inform the government's response to the pandemic. We've also publicly provided the data to Canadians to keep them informed. We remain focused on Canadians' health and safety and continuing to uphold the privacy standards they rightfully expect.
Member for Barrie Innisfil.
Why was this vote so important yesterday, Mr. Speaker? It's because the Liberals, with their no vote, have signaled that they'll continue collecting this data without the consent of Canadians. And when you start connecting the dots, a pattern has developed by these Liberals using the distraction of a pandemic as an opportunity for massive expansion and overreach to abuse the rights and freedoms of Canadians, including their privacy rights. Would the Prime Minister at least provide a coherent reason why he thinks putting a pause on this tender was a bad idea and until we can ensure that the Canadians' privacy protection rights were protected?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we are fighting a global pandemic right now, and every step of the way we have been informed by science and data to do that. Yes, we've been protecting Canadians' privacy rights, which are always important, but we will use the tools we have to keep Canadians safe and defend their rights and values. Unfortunately, we do see the pattern of the Conservative Party that tried to scrap the long-form census, that is constantly against data and evidence, pushing back against science and data. We will be informed by the facts and by science in what we do.
Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. Conservatives want the protests and the barricades to end. We want people to be able to head back to work and go home knowing that they have been listened to and that they've been respected. The Prime Minister holds the key. I've asked the Prime Minister, I've sent him a letter, I've asked him if he would be willing to meet with other leaders, with myself, so that we could work constructively to end this impasse. Will he meet with us? Can we work together to find a solution? Thank you.
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, The interim leader of the Conservative Party knows well that we spoke right after her election as leader to be able to work together to end this pandemic and to end these barricades and this blockage. Unfortunately, we see Conservative members continuing to encourage and support the blockades that are going on in downtown Ottawa, at the Coutts border crossing, at the Windsor Bridge. When are Conservatives going to stand up for ordinary Canadians putting food on their shelves and their jobs? When are they going to stand up, condemn these barricades?
The Ambassador Bridge crossing in Windsor is one of the busiest in all of Canada, and it's vital to the people of Windsor and the surrounding region. Windsor and the surrounding region rely heavily on travel back and forth between the border. Residents, small businesses, manufacturing sectors all require it. Right now, because of the convoy protests, truckers are being blocked, and it's severely impacting Windsor and the surrounding region. What is the Prime Minister doing to end that shutdown and open up the border for the truckers to get back home and deliver the goods to Windsor and the surrounding region?
You're right, Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Ambassador Bridge is critical for trade, and this blockade poses significant risks to our supply chains. Illegally blocked trade routes means empty shelves, higher prices, and layoffs in the trucking, manufacturing, and retail sectors. It is ironic, Mr. Speaker, that a protest and a blockade that was ostensibly by truckers is now blockading truckers themselves. Mr. Speaker, Canadians have the right to peaceful protest, but they don't have the right to illegally block our roads or harass residents. So I want to once again thank the 90% of truckers who've been vaccinated and working hard every day to keep our economy moving.